There's a thin line between legend and oblivion. One single breath can decide it all. This is the story of that breath, the story of the Battle of the Valley of Lament. Etheria, a realm of light and knowledge, was not prepared for Morlock's ambition. His horde of shadows, an army of fanatics and corrupted beasts, devoured everything in its path. Hope flickered out one by one. The horde's advance was relentless, a tide of darkness washing over the vibrant green lands of Etheria. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were reduced to smoldering ruins overnight. The libraries, filled with the wisdom of ages, became fuel for their pyres. The people, once known for their art and song, became silent refugees, their faces etched with a grief too deep for tears. The fall was inevitable. Each victory for Morlock was another nail in Etheria's coffin. His strategy was not just conquest, it was erasure. He sought to wipe every trace of Etherian culture from the face of the earth, to replace it with his own brutalist monuments and a doctrine of fear. The world watched, but no one intervened. The shadow was too vast, too terrifying. Only one desperate plan remained: lure the horde into the Valley of Lament, a narrow gorge where numbers meant nothing. And only one man could lead that suicidal charge: Kaelen, the Lion of Etheria, a hero whose legend was beginning to rust. The king, his face a mask of despair, looked at Kaelen not as a general but as a last flickering candle in an encroaching storm. Kaelen, no longer the brash champion of his youth, accepted the command with a quiet gravity. He knew what was being asked of him. It wasn't a battle to be won, it was a sacrifice to be made. 300 souls against 10,000. They would not fight for glory, nor for victory. They would fight for time, to buy their people a few more days to flee, with the price of their own blood. As they marched into the Valley of Lament, the towering cliffs seemed to close in around them like the jaws of a great stone beast. These weren't the elite guard, the knights in shining armor. These were farmers, blacksmiths, and poets, men who had traded their tools for swords, their fear held in check by a fierce, protective love for their families. They were the remnants of a shattered army, bound together by a single, hopeless purpose. They set to work, their hands raw, building barricades from loose rock and splintered wood, turning the valley into a death trap they would share with their enemy. In the cold night before dawn, they spoke not of tactics, but of home, of children they'd never see grow, of loves they'd leave behind. Kaelen, the lion, became a father to those doomed souls. He walked among the small campfires, a quiet, reassuring presence in the oppressive darkness. He didn't offer empty promises of survival. Instead, he listened. He learned the name of a young soldier's daughter, shared a piece of hard bread with an old farmer, and clasped the shoulder of a boy barely old enough to shave. He reminded them that their stand, however brief, would be the most important story ever told about Etheria. It was the story of how they chose to face the end, not with despair, but with a courage that would echo through eternity. In those final quiet hours, they weren't soldiers. They were brothers, united in their shared fate. At dawn, the earth began to tremble. It started as a low hum, a vibration felt in the bones, then grew into the thunder of 10,000 marching feet. The horde of shadows appeared at the valley's mouth, a sea of black iron and monstrous forms, blotting out the rising sun. They were a force of nature, an avalanche of hatred and steel. On their crude banners, the symbol of Morlock, a bleeding eye, seemed to mock the small band of defenders. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat and foul beasts, and the sound of their war horns was a discordant scream that promised only oblivion. Kaelen stood before his men, his old armor gleaming faintly in the dim light. He drew his sword, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. He didn't give a grand speech. He simply looked each man in the eye, a silent acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Then he raised his blade and roared a single word: Etheria! It was not a battle cry, it was a prayer. And with that one word, 300 men roared back, their voices a defiant thunder against the coming storm. The first wave of the horde crashed against their barricades, and the battle for the last breath began. The clash of steel was deafening. Kaelen fought like a cornered lion, his blade a blur of silver, each strike precise, each movement born of a lifetime of war. He was everywhere at once, plugging gaps in the line, roaring encouragement, his presence a beacon of defiance. For hours, the 300 held. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. They made the horde pay for every inch of ground in blood. But the enemy was a relentless tide. One by one, the defenders fell. A farmer who had dreamt of his fields was cut down. A poet whose last thought was a line of unsung verse was trampled. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, their resolve did not. They fought on, a dwindling island of courage in a sea of darkness. The valley floor became a grim tapestry of the dead and dying, the stones slick with rain and blood. Soon, only Kaelen remained. He stood upon a mound of his fallen comrades, his body a canvas of wounds, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The horde paused, their bloodlust momentarily replaced by a grudging awe. Before them stood not a man, but a monument to defiance. Morlock himself, clad in obsidian armor, rode forward. He saw the old warrior leaning on his broken sword, and he smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. He raised his hand, and a hail of arrows was unleashed, each one finding its mark. Kaelen fell to his knees, his lifeblood pouring into the earth. This is where our story began. Kaelen, bleeding, broken, watching the army march toward him. He knew his end was here. But as he looked up, past the jeering face of Morlock, he saw it. Far beyond the valley, on the distant hills, a flicker of light. A signal fire, then another, and another. His 300 had not fought for nothing. They had bought the time they needed. The people of Etheria were escaping. He had succeeded. With his last ounce of strength, Kaelen took a deep, final breath. He pushed himself to his feet, a ghost of a smile on his lips. And as Morlock's army surged forward to claim their final victory, Kaelen let out that last breath, not as a sigh of defeat, but as a final defiant roar. It was a sound that carried on the wind, a sound that told the fleeing refugees that their sacrifice was not in vain. The horde swarmed him, but it no longer mattered. Kaelen, the Lion of Etheria, was gone. Morlock won the battle, but he lost the war. The legend of Kaelen and his 300 spread like wildfire. It became a rallying cry for the scattered remnants of Etheria and other free peoples. The story of their last stand, of their impossible courage, inspired a resistance that Morlock, with all his power, could never stamp out. His empire, built on fear, eventually crumbled, not by the force of armies, but by the power of a story of a single defiant breath. Kaelen and his men were never forgotten. They became the soul of the new Etheria. Their sacrifice a lesson taught to every child. The Valley of Lament was renamed the Valley of Heroes, a sacred place where legends are born not from victory, but from the will to stand against impossible odds. For in the end, a legend is not defined by how long one lives, but by the moments that make them immortal. Thank you so much for watching. The story of Kaelen reminds us that true strength isn't always about winning, but about the courage to fight for what you believe in, even when all hope seems lost. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of epic heroes. We'll see you in the next story. Dawn arrived, not the gentle, promising light of a new day, but a cold, iron dawn that heralded the end. Through the morning mist that clung to the valley floor, the ground began to tremble. It started as a low hum, a vibration you felt in your bones before you heard it. Then, the hum grew into a thunderous roar. At the mouth of the valley, a shadow took form, a dark wave cresting over the horizon. It was the Horde of Shadows. Guttural war cries, a symphony of rage and hunger, echoed off the stone walls. The Etherian drums answered, a defiant heartbeat against the coming storm. Morlock had come, and with him, he brought hell on Earth. The first wave of the Horde crashed against the Etherian shield wall, like a tidal wave against a cliff. The air thickened with a storm of black-feathered arrows, so dense they blotted out the morning sun. The sky turned dark, and for a moment, the world was nothing but the whistle of their descent. The Etherian shields locked together, a bronze shell of defiance. The impacts were brutal, a percussive nightmare of wood splintering and metal screaming. The front line held, but the cost was staggering. Each hammering blow against the shields sent shockwaves through the men. Each arrow that found a gap was a life extinguished. Every scream was a fallen hero, a name whispered into the chaos and then lost forever. This wasn't just a battle. It was a meat grinder, and the Etherians were being ground down, inch by bloody inch. For what felt like an eternity, the line held. But even the strongest wall will eventually crack under relentless pressure. A section of the shield wall buckled, a gap appeared, and the Horde poured through like a flood. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. Hope, once a burning flame, started to bleed away into the mud and gore. But then a roar cut through the din. It was Kaelen, the Lion of Etheria. He moved like a whirlwind of steel and fury, a demon of vengeance unleashed. His every strike was a lesson in brutal efficiency, his presence a beacon in the swirling chaos. A young soldier, his face a mask of terror, stood frozen as the enemy surged towards him. But then he saw Kaelen, saw the fire in his eyes, the absolute refusal to yield. That fury was contagious. The boy's fear was burned away, replaced by a surge of courage. He let out a yell, lowered his spear, and sealed the breach. This was no longer a battle for survival. It was a dance with death, and every Etherean was now a willing partner. Kaelen was a canvas of wounds, his armor dented and torn, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up, and through the swirling dust and smoke, he saw him. Morlock, the Shadow Lord, standing on a distant hill, watching the carnage unfold like a spectator at a grand play. In that moment, Kaelen knew. This was the end. There would be no victory here, no glorious ride home. He could order a retreat, try to save the few who remained, but he knew they wouldn't make it. So he made a different choice. He raised his blood-slicked sword and roared a single defiant phrase that would become an anthem. For Etheria! And he charged. Not towards Morlock, not to win the battle, but to sow chaos, to buy time. He plunged into the thickest part of the enemy host, a single point of light swallowed by an ocean of darkness. His men, seeing his final desperate act, echoed his cry. For Etheria! They screamed, their voices blending with the somber grand music of clashing steel. Kaelen saw the end of his story written in the enemy's eyes. Yet instead of turning from that final page, he embraced it. His final charge was not an act of madness or despair. It was an act of love. A love for his people, for his land, for the future he would never see. A love so fierce, so pure, it would echo through 1,000 generations. A testament to the power of one man's sacrifice. He fought until he could no longer stand, his final moments a maelstrom of defiance that carved a legend into the very soul of his nation. When silence finally fell over the valley, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The 300 Ethereans lay among thousands of their fallen foes. The ground was slick with the cost of their defiance. Morlock walked the battlefield, his expression not of triumph but of quiet, unsettling awe. He had claimed the field, but he had lost something far more valuable. His aura of invincibility. The legend of the unstoppable horde was broken here, shattered against the will of 300. He turned, without a word, and walked away. His army, broken and demoralized, followed him into the shadows. The time Kaelen and his men bought with their blood was just enough. Etheria survived. None of those 300 lived to see the dawn they had secured. They would never hear the songs sung in their honor or see the statues raised to their memory. But their story, sealed with Kaelen's last breath, became the first breath of a reborn nation. From the ashes of their sacrifice, Etheria rose, stronger and more united than ever before. Their legend was passed down from parent to child, a sacred inheritance. They were not remembered for how they died, but for why they had lived, for a cause, a belief, something far greater than themselves. Legend teaches us a profound truth. Victory is not measured in the number of enemies slain or the amount of territory gained. True victory is measured in the time bought for others, in the hope that is defended against all odds. It's in the spark that refuses to be extinguished, even when surrounded by darkness. So let me ask you this. What would you fight for? What is the ideal, the love, the hope that you would defend, no matter the cost? This story is dedicated to all who choose to be the light against the darkness. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If their story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of courage and sacrifice. We'll see you next time.